Good evening. A historian, a political strategist, and a general walk into a drone assembly workshop, getting serious about deterrence, warfare, and multilateralism. This event is hosted by the Leibniz Science Campus, Europe and America, in the modern world of the University of Regensburg, the LSE Ideas, and the Center for Military History and Social Sciences of the Bundeswehr in Potsdam. We are living through a period of accelerated geopolitical fragmentation and technological disruption. Russia's war against Ukraine has shown that adaptation, military, industrial, political, and societal, must happen now in an unprecedented speed. Yet the communities shaping these adaptations, academics, policymakers, and defense tech innovators, too often operate in silos, parallel rather than together. This panel brings these perspectives into dialogue to address a central question: how quickly European states, societies, and industries adapt to shifting technological and political ecosystems. So let me briefly introduce our speakers on this panel who are supposed to facilitate that very rare form of dialogue. We are joined by Mary Calder, Professor Emeritus of Global Governance and Director of the Conflict Research Program at LSE Ideas at the London School of Economics. We have Marina Rutsenko, who's co-founder and executive director of the Kiev-based Snake Island Institute. Also with us is Alaric Searle, who is academic director at the Center for Military History and Social Sciences of the Bundeswehr in Potsdam. We are joined by Josef Granawetvogel, who is co-founder and senior vice president at Stark, or Stark, as we would pronounce it in German, a European defense tech company developing unmanned systems and currently especially in a very close collaboration with Ukrainian armed forces. And the Bundeswehr. And Jon-Wyatt, researcher affiliated with the University of Regensburg, the Leibniz Science Campus, and a project associate of the Building Resilience in a New Age of War program at LSE Ideas. My name is Cindy Wittke-Hohlfeld. I'm professor for normativity and international politics at the University of Regensburg and head of the political science department at the Leibniz Institute for East and Southeast European Studies. Together, this panel brings perspectives from theory, practice, history, and innovation, which is exactly what we need to understand not just how adaptation is happening, but whether it is happening fast enough, so that we are not only respond to current challenges, but maybe also shape the challenging and the new security order. Before I jump into the first question, a reminder to the panel. So we have a very colorful audience, and not everyone will be familiar with all the abbreviations that are usually connected to unmanned systems, how we will generally refer to here on this panel. So if you are falling into jargon, please remind yourself of introducing abbreviations and also maybe being very descriptive about what you mean. I have a very long cheat sheet from John that I then will use and intervene if that goes into much jargon. So let me jump to the first question. At the World Economic Forum in Davos, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney argued in a much-noted speech that we are in a rupture and not in a transition, and that nostalgia is actually not a strategy. He also pleaded for principled pragmatism and also for managing variable geometries in international relations. If that is the case, the question is how security is being reshaped in real time, especially for what he referred to as the middle powers. So question to each of you on the panel. From your vantage point, how does the emergence of unmanned systems and distributed warfare fit into current ruptures of the global order? Are we witnessing the erosion of traditional deterrence? And what strategic options does this create or foreclose for European states? So, Mary, I'm looking at you, and I already met some people who confessed that they belong to your fan circle, and like me, they academically grew up with your books on new wars, on international law and politics, and also on your concepts of civicness. So how do you see the world?
Gosh. So I totally agree that this is a rupture. What's happening now is not just about the accidental rise of authoritarian governments. It is a rupture in world affairs, and I think what it has to do with is the end of the American model of development, which I call Fordism, the model of development based on mass production, the intensive use of fossil fuels, cars, airplanes, and so on. And I think the problem is that our political institutions, which were very much forged around that model of development, are now out of kilter with far-reaching economic, social, technological change. I use the term, actually, experimental juncture to describe moments like these, because they're moments when people lose trust in their institutions and where politicians face an existential crisis and they don't know what to do and they experiment. And very often they experiment in very bad ways and things get worse before they start hitting upon good experiments. So to your question about this rupture, I think what we must learn from this is that we need a very different security paradigm from what we had in the past, one that is much more in tune with the changing nature of the world. I think it would be a huge mistake, and I fear very much that people are falling back into traditional Cold War thinking and traditional deterrence thinking. And I think we need to remember that we don't actually know whether deterrence, and here I'm talking about nuclear deterrence, worked. Both Kissinger and Schlesinger said it would be mad to think that the Americans would come to the support of Europe in this instance. But even though we don't, what I think was the consequence was that it kept alive a permanent fear of war. And I think that fear of war was really important in sustaining Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe and was really important in underpinning American hegemony. And we don't want to go back to that kind of model. It was very dangerous and very provocative. So how are things different? And I think they're different both in terms of threats and in terms of technology, which other people will talk about. Of course, we have to be worried about the Russian military threat, and especially if you live in the frontline states. But we also face a political threat that is coming not just from Russia, but is coming from all over and is aimed from the United States, from China, aimed at undermining democracy. And we talk about hybrid threats, misinformation, cyber attacks, localized separatist engagements. Those are the things that we should be really worried about. And they're aimed really at supporting the rise of the far right, so that we need to think differently about security. It needs to include all that. So that's one change. And the other change, of course, which other people will talk about, is a technological change. Our weapon systems were born of the Fordist era. That was the moment of cars and tanks, and now we talk about tanks and aircraft. And what we learn from Ukraine is that they are very vulnerable. And yet, the Kiel Institute have just produced a paper, 90% of the increased defense procurement spending is going on these traditional systems. So we really need to rethink technology. And so my final point is, what do we need? Well, I think we do need effective conventional defense, but it needs to be defensive and not provocative. We don't want to create a permanent, long-term. We don't want to create pretexts for Russia, is the way I would put it. But we also need to emphasize what I would call democratic resilience. We need to recognize that there are trade-offs between defense spending and welfare and international aid. Conflicts all over the world are a real risk to our security. What happens in Palestine, what happens in Sudan, as well, of course, first and foremost in Ukraine, are really going to affect security in Europe. But also we need to recognize that people are very vulnerable to disinformation. And they're vulnerable because of polarization in our society, because of inequality, because of this sense that no one is listening. And that's why we really need an approach that emphasizes how do we address these issues so that people can behave as Ukrainians do in crises, who are really resilient to these threats.
Exactly. So the question now actually goes next to Marina. From the broad world perspective of Mary, zooming radically in to Ukraine that currently fights a war of defense.
So thank you so much for having me. I've been thinking a lot about the question of power. As a Ukrainian, that's honestly everything you think about every single day. I grew up in a family of 2 Ukrainian Air Force officers, and I was born already in independent Ukraine. And I have always looked up to the idea of NATO and to the idea of the Western collective system and to the rule of law, because NATO, we all remember, has been created for the sole reason of protecting the European, the Western world from Russian invasion. You can judge yourself how that went, but I've always felt like there is systems that have been put in place in power that are there to protect us. And I was a big history nerd, and I've always thought how great that right now the threat of the imperial threat of Russia, the colonial threat of Russia, even though it's still there, it is not as active because we have the West to protect us. Then I spent 5 years studying in the United States. And as a student of international relations, all of my education has been about colonialism, about decolonization, about the real politic in a way, but also about the strong systems that work. And I have always sought and tried to bring into the conversation Russian colonialism and Russia as an empire. And I was always very often dismissed in that, because the arguments that I've heard is you're white, you're Christian, it doesn't fall into this. And I saw in my education how much this misunderstanding of Eastern Europe, of Russia's imperial power, what Soviet Union is and how it was, and what Russians really want has been missing. And then the war came, full-scale invasion, and I'm going to speak for many Ukrainians here that all of our trust and all of our ideas of the Western collective security system have failed and shattered. I always say that when I'm asked how Ukrainians survive a lot on memes and sarcasm. And every single time there is another reaction of a concern by any Western power, there is memes about it. We don't take it seriously. And now when there was Iran and when there was Venezuela, or when any other thing is happening, we see all of these concerns and we're like, okay, guys, now you're going to understand how we feel. And now that when I saw Carney's speech, it made a really big impression on me, actually, because I was thinking, on one way, where does the power lie? On one way, we have, realistically, the strong countries that are strong either economically and can manipulate us with tariffs, right, for example, or we have militarily strong countries, or we have the nuclear deterrence, and realistically, they're able to do whatever they want. Trump can say that he wants Greenland, and Europe is going to be running and replying to him. Russia can invade Ukraine. Putin can state from 2007 or from 2001, when he started talking about his ideas that the fall of the Soviet Union was the worst catastrophe, and that he wants to reinstate all of the territories. and no one heard him. In 2007, no one heard him here in Munich at the Munich Security Conference. Then there was Georgia, then there was Crimea. The first person I knew that died in this war was my dad's student, who was studying to fly pilot, to be a pilot, and he would come to my home and pretend to be a Santa for me and my sister. And he died in 2014 first. That's when it came to my life at first. And I have not seen any of this powerful reaction, right? And the world didn't react. So in one way, we see that now the strong have the power, and all of our collective belief in democracy and in values at the end of the day result in the fact that my people have been dying for 12 years. And we hear a lot of action, and we have a lot of great companies that are working and trying to change this, but at the end of the day, this is the situation that's happening. On the other side, when I think about power, I see so many examples of asymmetry that are happening in Ukraine. So Ukraine right now controls around 30% of Black Sea, and we have destroyed around 20% of Russian fleet. We lost 80%, sorry for so many numbers, of our fleet in 2014 when Russia invaded Crimea. How we were able to do this? Because two of Ukrainian security services, so like the Ukrainian GUR, which is the analogy, I can only give American analogies, I'm very sorry, CIA, and then the Ukrainian analogy of the FBI, were able to actually work in this ecosystem and to create the drones. I'm going to try not to use the acronyms, basically the naval drones that were cheap, that were remade from the civilian drones that we used before. One of the companies was done by our former prime minister, like people, regular military or different technicians and engineers, and we were able to win this war in the Black Sea. And that shows an asymmetry without having a fleet. And now at SII, for example, we focus a lot on analyzing how that was able to happen and what does it tell us about these traditional fleets. Then to give you a bit of more examples of numbers, because we were talking here about this asymmetry. So the Shahed drone that attacks us costs around $35,000. The Shahed drones, if you try to intercept it with a Patriot missile, does anyone know how much it costs? It costs $3 million. In Ukraine, we learned and we've built our people that were engineers, and they all volunteered and have never tried to be military and volunteered and went to the military now. They've built drones, interceptor drones, that cost around the same as Shahed. And now we're able to intercept it, not with something that costs $3 million, but something that costs around the same, right? So does power lie in this asymmetry, in this mass and cheap scale production, in an ability to find different ways, or does it lie in the strongholds that are traditionally there? That's something that I think a lot as a Ukrainian these days, and I honestly don't have a strong answer, because you see where the peace talks are going. That's what I'm going to end here with.
Thank you very much, Marina. So Marina made historical references, and also Mary made historical references, which is now, of course, screaming for the venture point of a historian. So we have been referencing the 80s, we have been referencing colonialism. So how does the current situation look from your venture point, Alaric?
Okay, thanks very much. First of all, we just have to say how impressive it's been what Ukraine's done, and we can't be really thankful enough to the Ukrainian people. And I would agree with all of the points you made about Russian imperialism. It goes back to the 19th century, possibly even the 18th century. So to pick up on points that both Amerikahaus and you've made, the first thing when we're going to try and get into the question of technology. So I would say, make a bold statement, there's no such thing as revolution in technological developments, there's only evolution. So if we look at drone warfare, it's been around, I think it was first operationalized by ISIS in 2015 in the Syrian civil war. And what we now have is a very rapid development of drone technology, which has got huge implications. But at the same time, it's not something that's just appeared out of nowhere. That's an important point. And this links into what Amerikahaus said about the fundamental rupture, the change. So I don't think it's come from drones. Technological evolution just goes along, in a sense, parallel to the other developments, and at some point they intersect. So when it comes to the rupture of the global order, The way I see it, probably as a historian, is that the West, in inverted commas, I'll come back to who the West is. The West is engaged in a six-front war at the moment. 3 military fronts, 3 non-military fronts. The first military front is Ukraine and Russia. The front line of democracies between democracy and dictatorship runs through eastern Ukraine. The second front is Taiwan, China, and the front line of democracy and between democracy and dictatorship runs through the Taiwan Straits. The third military front is the Middle East. That's so complicated, I can only just reference it. And then the 3 non-military fronts are, first of all, climate change, secondly, financial crises, and third, the erosion of formerly stable Western institutions, universities, the judiciary, health service, and so on. And trying to conceptualize what's going on in the world, I think we need to reduce it to these 6 fronts, how they interact with each other. Of course, the issue with deterrence is an important one. And I think even before the Russian aggression against Ukraine, deterrence was still being thought of by the Americans in terms of nuclear deterrence, because that was their, if you like, stranglehold over the world order. Stranglehold maybe in inverted commas. But the advance of technology has been such, so dual-use systems, we've seen that in Ukraine. The blurring of the lines between conventional and nuclear war has meant that we now have, if you like, an acceleration of technological development, which is adding to the already existing rupture of the world order. I mean, I call it the new status quo of instability. So in terms of the new status quo of instability, we have if you like, the rise of the kleptocracy of Putin's Russia, the rise of, excuse me, China as a destructive power in terms of the environment, destroying its own natural resources. 75% of the arable land is infected with chemicals, heavy metals. 90% of the water is infected in some kind of way, and they're now moving on with their, if you like, colonial project, destroying other countries, particularly in Africa. So we have this, if you like, 6-front war of the West. And the big question is, well, does America belong to the West anymore or not? You know, this is one of the big strategic questions. How long will it take before America returns to the democratic fold? And it's a parallel question to how long will Putin be alive and carry on his kind of psychopathic obsession with trying to take over Ukraine.
So many different loose ends, but a couple of those loose ends I would like now to play to Josef. So we heard very impressively from Marina about how power asymmetry can take a different turn with new technology. And Alaric said, well, do we see a technological revolution or do we rather see evolution? So how does it look from your view?
So, short answer, just an evolution. But what I want to point out, my whole life was connected to manned systems and unmanned systems, because I started my career as some kind of Air Force officer in 2006. I joined German Armed Forces. I went to officer school, and I studied aerospace engineering. At this time, it was quite normal. You have had manned fighter aircraft, so nothing to worry about. Quite a lot of pilot training, and I grew up, or my military life started like being a technical officer, dealing with manned systems, manned fighter aircraft, Tornado, Eurofighter, and everything was quite normal. I do remember when the conflict in Bergkarabakh started, and I recognized, being still a military guy, that something is changing, because unmanned systems came up with doing warfare, fighting against manned military units on ground, in air, and everything else. But as long as I remember, nobody really woke up in the German Armed Forces. I saw quite a lot of reports about this, what is ongoing, and we had discussions about, will it change modern warfare? And I do remember we we have had, no direct consequences about this. And then I went to General Staff Officers course in Hamburg. It's a really interesting course. It takes 2 years, and we discussed modern warfare. We talked about multi-domain operations. And we were tasked to look in the future of warfare. It was really interesting because concepts from US side like mosaic warfare came up. So what is it about? It is about that normally it takes up to 20 years to develop a fighter aircraft. Not because people are lazy or engineers are sleeping quite a lot, but it's really complex. And you have to deal with, it's a whole system, you have to deal with effectors, you have to deal with sensors, you have to combine all these kind of components. And in case technology is evolving or developing, you have to qualify or re-qualify the whole system. You have to deep dive into all kind of avionics and so on and so on. So it takes roughly 10 to 20 years to have a new aircraft. But the world around us is not somehow stopping or standing still. And I compare it always like if there is a newborn child and I buy a mobile phone at this time of birth and I hand it over after 18 years, it won't be the state-of-art mobile phone you can use anymore. But talking about military procurement so far, it was like the same like this. So it took 10 to 20 years to get systems into armed forces. And then we talked about mosaic warfare, and I do know we had a presentation to a bunch of generals talking about that warfare is changing. We have to somehow change our procurement cycles. We have to change how we set up military units, structures, and everything else, because it's not only about integrating unmanned systems to normal military units and then it's done and you have a check mark. You have to think about how you integrate it organically, how you use it, how you set up concept of operations, and so on. We had brilliant discussions. We talked with industry leaders. We talked with people. When the war in Ukraine started, I was still attending the officers course. We talked to Ukrainians, and we saw what is going on. I do remember when Russian troops tried to cross rivers, and they queued up with quite a lot of tanks, and they were blown up by unmanned systems. It looked ridiculous to us because I'm an Air Force officer and not dealing with tanks, but it's not really cool or clever to do this. But somehow, even though we had this presentation, everybody was like not really laughing, but telling us, but that's not the future. And we have to stick to our old systems. We still have to use manned tanks on ground and manned fighter aircraft and manned maritime systems, boats and ships. And our intention was not to somehow get rid of all manned systems, but to integrate unmanned systems, to elevate or to improve the fighting force of old legacy systems. And then I went over to space business. And I mean, satellites are the oldest unmanned systems you can imagine, because you're not able to, Russia sent monkeys to the orbit, but it's not durable. And and I worked in space business, and it was a rough time because space is not only about satellites, it's more about services. You need services for communication, you need services for doing reconnaissance on Earth observation, and navigation. And at this time, I do remember there was no money left for satellites or for services. And after a time being, I quit my military career because I was not able to stand it anymore, to see how things are happening in Ukraine, and that our Western militaries, not only German Bundeswehr, but all the others, are not really responsive or getting information out of Ukraine and dealing with changes. And I do remember one visit to the US side, to the Marines, US Marines at Quantico. They have been pretty aware of the changing nature of warfare, and we had a discussion about what it means. And the US Marines have a size of the German Armed Forces, and they completely changed the force structure because of they have been aware dealing in the Indo-Pacific. You have to be more mobile, you have to use unmanned systems and so on. And they did it. And in the German Armed Forces, it took quite a lot of time. Right now we are talking about loitering munitions and drones and everything else, but still we can procure all these kind of systems, but we have to have some kind of awareness how we will use it. It's not only about having drones or replacing old systems, manned systems with unmanned systems. It's about how we conduct all these kind of operations. And if we look at Ukraine, what they are doing, it's not only about sending drones for deep strike missions. It's like how you integrate it in containers, shipping them to Russian aircraft or airfields, and dealing with all these kind of creative approaches. And that's still what I miss in Germany or Western militaries. And I think technically it's just an evolution, but from a mindset perspective, it's a revolution.
Mm-hmm. So it maybe needs a political revolution also, and a political change. So John, you waited patiently. John wrote his PhD thesis inter alia on war games, and I know that he visited those drone assembly workshops. So as a historian, but also someone who dives very deeply into those defense and deterrence structures, what would be your summarizing venture point for this first round?
Oh, no pressure.
No.
So I wrote a dissertation on US-German training exercises in the Cold War as a cornerstone of the West. And I started writing in 2020, and by the time I submitted in 2025, well, I think that we definitely can see, or I would confirm the opinion that we're in a period of rupture. And the theme that I'd want to concentrate on is the way that we use force in the armed forces. So as a young man, my first experience with war would have been 9/11, of course. Growing up in New Jersey, we actually knew a few people whose lives were lost, and we had firefighters from my hometown respond. In fact, actually, my first cat came from the disaster site in Manhattan. And my experience of military force watching the television was of the United States military pulverizing from the air, you know, absolutely elite strikes. Precision was always the word being used. And if you look back on the Gulf War, there was the French sociologist Jon-Wyatt wrote, the Gulf War never happened. Because he said, if you look at the media, they won't let us anywhere near the front line. The way that military force is used in an era of precision is precise air power brought from the coast of the United States all the way across on the other side of the world, directed into Iraq, into Kuwait. And it looked like this sort of, I don't know, this like all-powerful use of military force to counter what was told to us, the great enemy of Saddam Hussein. And I was always told my entire life that the United States was the most powerful country in the world, that its values required defending. And so to me, the person wielding that force was the professional soldier, was someone grown up in the ethos of the United States military. Perhaps they have lineage dating back to the Second and First World Wars. And it took my entire life to visit Kyiv during the full-scale invasion to, at least in my opinion, meet actual people fighting for freedom on the front lines. But they weren't mostly professional soldiers. So we did interviews of drone pilots. They were DJs. One of them was a candy salesman. Another one worked as a software developer. And all of them became drone pilots. Now let's ask ourselves, how was military force used in that way? In the first Gulf War and then in the Iraq War, the United States military learned its lesson from Vietnam. They did not allow reporters onto the front line. The reality was violent and horrible. However, our experience as the public, as citizens of democracies, was, well, we could just ignore it, quite frankly. I think we renamed a street in my hometown after a fallen soldier, but we weren't viscerally part of this. But even now, in the safety of Germany, we can go on Twitter, we can go, I call it Twitter, we can go on YouTube, and we can watch human beings' lives being lost by unmanned systems. Our experience of this war, be you physically in Kyiv or in Ukraine or here, you can see how this force is directed. And so one of the key words you always hear is asymmetry, right? You have small and medium powers can use unmanned systems to equalize force against a greater power. And we see that in Ukraine right now. But asymmetry can cut both ways because mass is going to come back. Precision, the era of the US Air Force dominating all enemies, I don't know if it's over, but it is in rupture. Because now, when we consider, at the end of 2024, President Zelensky said, in 2025 we'll build 1 million drones. And now in 2026 he says we'll build 7 million drones. How many can China build? We already know the question as to how many Russia can build. Command economies are going to strike back with mass. And unmanned systems are going to be a core part undergirding that. So that would be the first and most important point, is that the enemies of democracy are going to use these tools as well as our colleagues here on the stage are going to try to use them to defend us. And we can see in Ukraine right now 2 responses to this rupture. So the first is Russian absolute callousness to the lives of their soldiers. I have seen enough videos of 2 or 3 isolated Russian soldiers in the middle of an open field only to meet their end by a drone. What sane person would command a soldier to do that? I certainly hope none of our own armed forces would do that. And then we see the Ukrainian response, which is to use mass, in the words of someone I'm very proud to call an associate of mine, Pavlo Kazan from the Unmanned Systems Forces. He told me in an interview, we use drones to preserve the lives of our soldiers, to try to remove the human being away from danger. And so I think that when we think about unmanned systems, we have to think about the person behind it and also the person being affected by it. And that the way that force is used, we'll have to reckon with for the rest of our lives, I think.
Wow, that's of course bringing the dehumanizing effect and the humanizing or the human dimension into the picture. And let us zoom in further from here to a very concrete tension that I had in mind when listening to Marina, but also to Josef and now to you, John, which is that European defense has for a very, very long time focused on cost-intensive, high-end platforms. But modern warfare and modern conflict demands mass, cheap, scalable, and attritable systems. So how do we reconcile the doctrines, the political doctrines and the political mindset that is still out there and procurement systems built for high-end platforms with reality that demands those mass systems and that may only cost then a few €100 or a few $100. I consciously put the euros into this and not the dollars into this. So we heard your perspective, but maybe, Mary, how would you take this up from a political economy perspective?
Yeah, well, I was longing to come back in again because I do think there are technological revolutions. And I think at a certain moment when new technologies evolve, how political institutions or military or doctrines transform. It's the social relations of technology or the political relations of technology, as you said, a political revolution that makes something a technological revolution. Now, I wrote a book that was published in 1982, and it was called The Baroque Arsenal. It was actually published in German as well. And in that book, I said, we're developing systems in a linear development from World War II that are becoming more expensive, more complex, and more difficult to use. And they're the consequence of the relationship between the defense industry and governments. And they are now challenged by what we then called precision-guided munitions. It was before drones, but we were talking, and there were a lot of people, particularly here in Germany, who were talking about how we need a change in doctrine. So I think that's one, so it has a long history, and actually drones have a longer history. I mean, drones came into being after the War on Terror, and we shouldn't forget the American campaign of long-distance assassination, which had, I think, I don't know if we want to get into this, but this is really disturbing consequences for international law, the idea that you can kill people even if they're not in an army.
The targeted killings.
Exactly, the targeted killings, which then legitimized, I think, the Israelis to say, if we all terrorists are illegal combatants that we can kill, and it doesn't matter if we even kill them in their homes, because we're allowed to kill them, or we can blow them up with pagers, even if it's not on the battlefield. So it was a real change. And that's one way technology was changing in a very disturbing way, in my view. So the kind of doctrine that you develop in order to take into account the new technology is terribly important. And I think Jack made the point that I think actually what the new technology does mean is a real advantage to the defence. And I think that's very important, because that means that we can think about war in terms of what's legal, and one thing that's legal is to defend against aggression, but not necessarily to provoke and to attack as well. And I think the other thing that we're learning is that it's actually incredibly difficult to gain geopolitical advantage militarily now. You can defend yourself, but look, Russia's moving inch by inch. It's really, really difficult. And so I think that actually justifies thinking about rethinking doctrine so that it's much more defensive. It relies much less on these expensive, complicated systems. So it might end up being altogether cheaper, even if mass is important. All of that we have to learn, and that does mean rethinking our military-industrial relationships as well. So all of that's very important, and I hope we'll get to other issues later as well. But anyway.
But jump to another issue. If we take all this serious, then the question is not just what we buy, but how fast can also the production line really produce and adapt. And then beyond the hardware is actually also about the challenges of knowledge production when it comes to software, AI, data sovereignty, and supply chains that operate like on the battlefield and beyond. So where does Europe stand when it comes to producing and updating these systems at speed rather than at the pace of bureaucracy? And of course, I'm looking at Joseph for that question from the industry side. What are the real bottlenecks?
I mean, if you look at Europe, we are not lacking technology, or we are not lacking knowledge, or we are not lacking capabilities to produce in mass. If you look at automotive, if you compare automotive to drone business, big companies, they produce millions of cars. I would be lucky to produce millions of drones in order to deter Russia, that we are able to outproduce Russia. But it's not so simple as it seems, because what we have to understand, and I really love the political discussion ongoing, that we have to save employees and everything else right now because automotive is declining and everybody should work in drone business. I think it's not too easy, because looking back to the COVID pandemic, everybody was like asking, hey, why can't automotive industry produce masks? And actually, nothing was going on. And same is happening right now once again, because yeah, you have robotics and you have everything else, but you need time to adjust all these kind of processes. You need a political will to do this. And yesterday I spoke to some people and they were telling me, yeah, but we are not in a state of changing our economy because we are facing war right now. It's still, we are living in peacetime. I don't know. There's a gray zone in between peacetime and wartime. But what I understand so far is it takes time to change our economy. It takes time to automate the production of drones. And right now what we see in Europe, we have quite a lot of production sites with huge amount of human beings assembling drones and everything else. So we can accelerate, but there has to be some kind of will. And it's not only about putting quite a lot of money on it and telling the drone industry, hey, you have to produce more. The challenge is, if I produce drones in millions, do I really have to, in Europe, I can't use them. Hopefully I don't have to use them. Perhaps I do some training for military guys. But the other way of, I have to store them somewhere. And there is a challenge coming up, because in case I store 1 million drones, hardware and software is developing really fast. And just talking about software, if I need 10 minutes for a software update for 1 million drones in a storage, yes, it's a good business case to conduct all these kind of updates. And I'm not talking about hardware so far, but even hardware is changing, looking at all kind of data links, what you need. I mean, batteries, you have quite a lot of improvements leading to more endurance and so on and so on. So how can we deal with this kind of challenges? Because I don't want to store, as we did it before, weapon systems in storages over years, over decades, over 10 years, because they're outdated. I open the storage and I can't use it anymore because the systems...
They're museums.
Yeah. So we have to find other ways to somehow deal with the challenges. And the other topic is, okay, if I look at Europe, and I was really frustrated because if you look at electronic components or like electric motors, you find quite a lot of companies that can set up these kind of components, but not in a scale. And you know, you have only small numbers, but having 1,000 drones, you need at least, I don't know how many motors, but how can you tackle these problems? And then you look at China. They're able to produce in high quality quite a lot of products. And if I look at Ukraine, they deliver both sides because it's a business. They deliver Ukraine and they deliver Russia. And the German or European market is not really competitive. And I think it's not because we don't have technology or we don't have production processes and everything else, but there was no need to do this because everybody of the Western economies, they felt pretty good with buying stuff from China and equipping the systems, even the weapon systems. If you look at F-35, there are quite a lot of Chinese components in electronics and everything else. And I don't talk about kill switches from the US side that they can shut down systems here in Germany and everything else. So I think we have to rethink in a holistic approach because we don't lack resources to do this.
I see the double finger of Mary, but Mary, if you have a couple of minutes patience, because I would like to play the ball also to Marina, just to see also from the Ukrainian perspective what production at speed actually might mean in practice. And then maybe you have 3 fingers, Mary.
No, because probably my finger was related to what Marina's going to say.
Yeah, well, everything in Ukraine is about speed. That's what all of the Ukrainians everywhere has been talking for a while now. But I'm just going to try to explain. So there was conversations about doctrines and about how we not only like operational and political adapt. So sometimes I have Western militaries coming to us and asking, oh, can you help to adapt a doctrine? And then when I started playing this game where I actually connect them to the military, the Ukrainian military, and let them ask. So the way the war is being waged changes every 2 to 3 months, completely. When we started at the very beginning of 2022, it was, in a way, trench warfare. And what was important was artillery and tanks and different other type of vehicles, armed vehicles and everything. Right now, it's useless. The way that the front line looks right now, there is this imaginable zero line, right, where there is the line between the two forces. And then 15 to 20 to now 25 kilometers, there is a kill zone. What is a kill zone? It's literally in this territory you cannot move because you're being watched by drones and you're being hit by drones from both sides. This is the reality. And right now, the way that you operate militarily is you have military sitting in the trench right at the beginning, but they're not really able to do anything. Well, we are not, because Russians are sending their military in packs to attack our sides, but we are, as been mentioned a lot here, actually taking care of our people and trying to exchange the human at the front with robots fighting the war. So, and every innovation that is happening is very, very, very quick. What we are seeing a lot is a lot of innovations, a lot of technical innovations, a lot of new types of defense tech is actually not always being done even by the companies, respectfully, by the military. So that is something that we noticed really, really recently. And a couple of, maybe in the last year, that military themselves develop the solutions they need. Why? Why have they been establishing the R&D, research and development centers all around the front lines? Like right now, I have a delegation of 6 military members with me here in Munich. They're all active duty, and a couple of them, they run different research and development labs, air defense research and development lab, or like FPV research and development lab, because when a Western company comes and talks and gets all of the information and all the problems, comes back to Europe or to America, makes something pretty and shiny and go through all of the different processes that are established and that are right and how you're supposed to operate a company, it comes back in a good case 3 and 4 months later, and usually I see like 9 months later, and brings something you're unable to use. The military themselves, the soldiers that were engineers before, and there were bartenders and DJs and everything that have learned these new skills, have developed something that works badly, but it works, that is not pretty, that's been ordered on AliExpress and brought there, and it works and it's there quickly. And they have changed, and the Russians have changed, and the speed is crazy. The way to adapt this is to understand the speed, is to not to try to learn the doctrine and to change the doctrine, is to realize, first of all, that if the focus is on the big, very expensive systems, it's never going to operate, because all of these big expensive systems are going to be destroyed by very small and mass-produced things. And 2, I mean, what I always say to all of the companies that come to us is to actually talk to the Ukrainians. There is a very different, there is a very big difference between learning the lessons in theory and thinking, oh, like, you should be quick, you should innovate, you should talk to, like, everyone talks about this, you should use drones are cool, like, literally. And at the same time, to adapt the lesson and to implement it institutionally. And that's where I see the big gap. And especially since we're talking about industry and even politicians, it's about talking, not pretending that you're talking to Ukrainians, but to actually Ukrainians are super open to collaborating. All of the military is very happy, but we've been, I'm going to be very honest, we've been walking around and talking to a lot of different manufacturers and investors all these days in Munich. I have a anti-Shahed person, I have an anti-wing person, I have an air defense R&D person, I have a person who started the first ever in the world strike UGV company, the Sword Assault Brigade. That's a different conversation, also a very interesting thing to learn. And they've been talking to all of these companies, and they say, Marina, everything they're telling us, they told us 5 months ago in Ukraine, and now they're presenting us the same things. We are ready, we want to share, we want to give them the lessons, we want to give them the needs, because for us, for Ukrainians, if there is solutions that are being provided, great, we're ready to take it. I was listening to one of the panels, and one of the speakers said, defense, let's make defense business. Okay, great, let's make defense business. I honestly, I'm going to speak for myself, I'm going to be very happy if defense tech companies in Europe and America make money. Please be successful, we're happy for that. Just provide us with the solutions that actually work. Because I see so many, like, I'm not going to name any names, but I've seen the companies that raised huge investments, that talk to their donors, to their investors, that they're tested in Ukraine, somewhere in Lviv, in Western Ukraine, never been on the front, and then we get the systems and we use them, and one of them broke during evacuation, and the person who was being evacuated died, and I actually knew that person. And after that, you think, okay, maybe it's better for the military to develop something themselves than to have, and then you see, imagine how the military feels with constant fundraisers and everything, and then they see it was like a couple of $1 million investment in the company where the system broke and the person died. So, sorry, it's not very positive, but it's the reality.
Well, thank you for this very complex picture of the reality. Mary?
My 2 fingers is this, that you can't reproduce wartime conditions. The real lesson from Ukraine is that you need to have resilience, commitment, a strong civilian industry, and a strong technological and scientific capability. And actually, that's what we should be focusing on. Just saying in a sort of knee-jerk way, we must increase defense spending without thinking about what it consists of, when what we really need is a strong civilian industry, a real commitment to our institutions, strong resilience. That's the real lesson from Ukraine.
So there are multiple gaps between the realities and the decision making, as it seems, and how to build political understanding for the speeds and the needs, especially in the European states, as it appears. So how does one raise the understanding in Berlin and Brussels or Paris and London? Are decision makers really willing to prioritize speed, experimentation, and risk, or are we still tied to old-style procurement cycles? So, Alaric, what would you say from contemporary history perspective?
So I think we're missing some pretty obvious lessons from Ukraine. The big success of Ukrainian weapons industry has been decentralization. So there's two, and I'm taking a risk here, I've got two experts right next to me, but as far as I can see it, decentralization means you don't have everything concentrated, it's not vulnerable to a massive strike. And then decentralization also means that you're encouraging smaller companies coming up with quick solutions, less bureaucracy. Ukraine is now producing, I think, 4 million drones a year. Is that correct? About that. And on the 8th of February, President Zelensky announced that they were going to open 10 sort of drone sales offices across Europe. That strikes me as being well, it's a tribute to Ukrainian inventiveness, but it's also a huge chance for Europe. So if we have decentralized weapons production within Europe, it would get round the things we've already heard about, slow processes which you have. The bigger the organization, the slower the processes. If we could have, bilateral agreements between different European countries, diversify across Europe, it would also assist in European integration in terms of the defense industry. We spent too much time in Europe on silly kinds of bureaucratic things, like every European country should have the same bus stop. These types of things. If we concentrated on defending ourselves, that would be a good step forward, and it would encourage integration in Europe. I agree that the big systems take a long time to develop. That said, we have seen that many of the Cold War systems work quite well in Ukraine. So the Gepard anti-aircraft system is being described as a museum piece, but it still works really well. The same with the Armada. These are old systems, but they've proved their worth. Same with the Bradley. It took a long time to develop, but it's very effective. But if we, I suppose, if we continue, then take a historical view. Second World War, First World War, decentralized arms production was actually one of the successes in the UK. It wasn't a sort of mass production, concentrated, specific area. It was multiple companies. So I think that's the way forward. And just one point which Mary Calder brought was drones will somehow increase the defensive. I'm very skeptical about that type of thinking because to give a David Petraeus answer, well, it depends. It depends who the war is between. It depends what kind of war is going to happen in the future. If we look at the sort of subversion tactics of the Russians, which is nothing new, it was the same in the Soviet Union. If we look at the kinds of things that China is moving towards, it may be we can have loads of drones, but lots of things are disabled through cyber warfare. So I think we have to be very, very careful about broad statements about this weapon system will improve the defensive. We saw that in Europe in the 1930s. Spanish Civil War, a lot of experts, experts in inverted commas, but militaries were saying the tank is useless, the defensive is the strongest form of warfare. And then in 1940, the French were rolled over by the Germans in 6 weeks. So there's lots of different things going on here. And I think we have to differentiate between the different levels of war and the different parties involved. So we have to think more in terms of multiple scenarios that could take place. And history is a very useful guide in that sense. Of course, as a historian, I'm obviously going to say that, but it doesn't mean to say it's not true. In fact, it is true.
And then the question is what history can teach us. But we've been focusing very strongly on that very high level, the elites, the others, that are very easily to point at what the governments are missing, what the big industries are missing, or where they should speed up. But all this doesn't stop with the military or the defense sector or the big decision makers. but it's actually reaching society itself. So we're debating drones now. Recently heard at the German public radio a report in the morning about drone warfare and asking the question of the Ukrainian bottom-up style is much more effective than the Russian centralized information style. And this is in the morning show of the German public radio, a report. So that indicates how much the debate is already within the society. So what does this make with society? And how does, for instance, total defense, the concept of total defense that is now very much also discussed in Bavaria, look for a modern democracy under these conditions? And how do we prepare society for long-term technological and mediated conflict? And I'm looking here at Mary, but then also maybe at John for answers on those questions. Maybe Mary, you make a start, because you've been already also just Alaric called you just out and indicated a disagreement with you. So maybe you can take that up, and then also.
Well, I do disagree with you on that issue of, and you also asked us a very interesting question about the political class. And I think that's a crucial problem today, which is, I think in almost every country, there's a sort of commitment that there seems to be an interest in winning elections and being power holders, rather than in thinking through what are the situations they've got to face. And I think that's our big problem at the moment. I mean, there seems to be this assumption that it's obvious that we're for increased defense spending, it's obvious that we have to substitute for the American nuclear weapons, without any thinking through how different the situation is today. So I think that's a really important point about how embedded our structures are, whether they're within NATO or wherever, that leads to this kind of groupthink that fails to take account of the reality of what's happening. And then on the issue of, do the new technologies favor the defensive or the offensive? Of course, you can be hugely destructive, as Israel has shown in Gaza and as Russia is showing. But the question is, can you win? I mean, what has Israel gained from all that it's done? Is Hamas really going to be disarmed? It's incredible that despite all this, Hamas still exists. So if we're talking about straight military, it's really hard to think how you use the military instrument to gain a military advantage. What you can do is to use the military instrument for genocide. What you can do is to do all this kind of hybrid warfare that means you try to create chaos and undermine democracy. But I think what it's very difficult to do is to kind of capture territory in the old-fashioned way. And I think that's something the military have to come to terms with, because it then means there's a fundamental change in the role of the military. Either you're going to be a terrorist, or if you're going to be a serious member of the armed forces, then your job is going to be to defend your country and to contribute to protecting people from genocide or from massive violations of human rights. And that requires something very different. Your concern is protecting people rather than defeating an enemy. You might have to defeat an enemy in order to protect people, but it's secondary. And in all of international humanitarian law, it's the other way around. So I think so I do disagree with you about this, but I think if we think in this constructive way, that actually the new technologies do make possible greater resilience, they do make possible greater democracy. We could easily think about that, but we do need fundamental changes at a political level if we're to be safe in the future. We need more global cooperation, and we also need much more democracy at a local, decentralized level. So all of those things need to change.
John, you always get the burden of the last word. And also, of course, here. So how does a total defense look like in a modern democracy? And from that drone assembly workshop.
I'm going to try to represent a few minority opinions all at once, just to provoke a bit more discussion. I have to admit, I don't think we stand a very particularly strong chance. I don't think our societies here in NATO Europe are resilient, and I think if you think they are, I'd love to see the evidence that you would have to present that. And I have a few examples. I'm a bit overeducated. I like to fancy myself as a smart chap, and I thought, perhaps I know a bit about Russia. And really, frankly, in 2022, 2023, I did not. My experience when the full-scale invasion happened was watching on Twitch a guy examining the Minsk highway system and the traffic heat map. And it was 5 hours before the invasion. He said, something's going to happen here. So that was my cutting-edge analysis of Russia, was online research and reading papers at the university. It took actually going to Ukraine, and I worked with a member of the Rada, and he said to me, you think you understand something intellectually, but you don't understand it as a human being. And so he took me to his hometown of Irpin, and I saw the bombed-out churches, and I saw in Bucha where, well, we all know what happened there, and we don't need to revisit that particular part. But my point is to say resilience, in some ways, is forced upon you. It's not some switch you put on and say, today I'm going to be a more resilient person. And I think the great example of this, when we look at unmanned systems, is the way that Ukraine has pioneered education in this area. So it was not the AFU that was the leading area of innovation for training drone pilots. It was actually civil society. There are some names, that come out like, well, I'll name them later, but the point is, if you look at Bori Vider, which is a drone school, if you look at Come Back Alive, if you look at Victory Drones, there's all these NGOs you may have never even heard of, and they have trained tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians in the use of these platforms. They have trained a literal entire British army worth of people, and they are just common NGOs staffed predominantly by veterans and civilians. And this is the type of ingenuity and resilience that comes from a people who have a shared cultural, political understanding of what the threat is, which is the threat of Russia, the thing that I used to not know anything about. And this is the big problem that I see, is if you look at countries that within living memory have experienced Russian imperialism, they are much further ahead than the rest of us. You don't need to mansplain to someone in Estonia or Finland what the strategic vision is. They don't need to go to Irpin to become a smarter person, because they have lived this experience or learned about it from their parents. And this is one of the biggest ruptures that we have when we look at unmanned systems, is that we don't have a shared strategic vision. So I promised a minority opinion, and here is where it is. I don't think the West is anything more than a military alliance with some capitalism, some democratic institutions. What value is agreeing with someone on the way that we want to structure our societies if we're not going to commit ourselves to a shared strategic security vision? So in the Cold War, right, the generation of my grandparents, why would a Louisianan die for West Germany? The country who had, within his living memory, declared war twice on his country. Why should a Nebraskan die for Lithuania today? We're all worried about Article 5 and whether the American commitment is still Teflon. But let's ask a rude question. Are the Portuguese willing to die for Poland? Are the French willing to die for, Finland? This is a question I think is entirely unanswered. It's not just about resilience here in one country, it's about resilience in a continental area. So I think that when we look for the examples, we need to start having a common storytelling of what is it that we want to achieve, and what is it that then translates our political imaginations of what the West is or what Europe is. Does the Europe involve the United Kingdom? Does it maybe now involve Canada? Here's the real question. What security architecture are we going to build so that we can invite Ukraine into a shared Article 5 situation? Because they've been defending us for 4 years 12 if you count the rest. And we've given them our best, we've shared technology, we've shared lots of funds, but we don't have that visceral experience of what they are fighting. And I think that, frankly, I'm quite worried about that. And I think that we can talk a very big game, but once the Shahed drones hit Berlin, my apartment in Berlin does not have a basement. So I can be as resilient as I want. I have nowhere safe to sleep. And the next subway station is very far away.
Well,
So
my apartment also doesn't have a basement. I can teach you where to go.
And I think you don't have to wait for Shahed drones in Berlin. Look at the electricity shutdown a few
Yes.
days ago. I was
freezing.
I went to Ukraine, to Kiev, the first week of January, and my colleagues, they handed over some power banks to me, telling me, hey, Joseph, perhaps you need one in Berlin. So
That's Ukrainian humor.
Told you, memes and sarcasm. It's the only way.
That's actually really Ukrainian humor.
Exactly.
So maybe this brings us really to our final round, also to open the floor for questions from the audience. So actually very fitting to John's intervention, Mark Carney warned, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So let me ask each of you very briefly, what is the single most urgent collective action we must take in the next 18 months to ensure Europe and its allies are shaping the new order rather than only reacting to this? You have 1 minute each, so really single out that one collective action that you would think is the most urgent for the next 18 months. So, Joseph, you already grabbed the mic. You're ready.
Really short. It's all about speed. And we can discuss on a high level, we can discuss on a strategic level, but we have to somehow come to actions. And we shouldn't over-discuss topics, but we should think about, okay, how concrete can we set something up? Not only about scaling industry and so on, but how can we strengthen our society in terms of resilience and so on and so on. It's all about speed, because I don't believe in that in terms of a war is coming, we just switch on off and everybody's ready to do something or to be more resilient. And we have to right now start, and we are running out of time.
Alaric, time. That's a good.
Okay, I'll fire it off rapidly. I don't agree with the question. There's one priority. There's multiple priorities. I'll reduce them. First of all, naming the enemy and what they're actually about. We've seen the face of Russia, but we've known a lot of these things in the past. Second, we need to increase European military cooperation. Third, we need to have more strategic debates about all the issues that are involved. I would say that's important. Fourth, we need to communicate to the population what the threats are, but also the grounds for optimism. So I disagree completely with John, what he said. I think there are plenty of grounds for optimism. Things take time, and it takes a while before things come together. And we need to have a clear strategic concept, a clear set of values that we're communicating that unifies people. And I think there is something called the West, and it does represent certain things. And if you don't believe me, look at what China represents in reality and what Russia represents in reality. Was that under a minute?
Yeah, roughly. Marina, 18 months is a lot of time from a Ukrainian perspective, right?
Yeah, I mean, my answer for speed has already been given, I guess. So I'm going to give maybe a bit of an unexpected answer in this way. But again, there's working with Ukraine, co-production, cooperation, listening to Ukrainian, being faster. Like, you guys are really, really slow. Like, it's crazy, like, really. But something that made Ukraine, coming back to the question of resilience in every single way, that helps us to really survive right now is this assumption of individual responsibility. I think that there are representatives of different groups here, right? But I see a lot of also young people and students, and in every single way in Ukraine, I see this assumption of that if you don't like something, you go change it. You hear so much about innovation in Ukraine, and this is something that I live by and how I was able to do what I do, is you might think that there is governments that are going to make the decisions, and governments have their election cycles. And there is so much that goes into this, and big corporations have all their production lines and everything. But I believe that if we are talking about, to refer to your point before, about European resilience, it's about understanding that there is a war somewhere else. Maybe some of you know Ukrainians, maybe some of you have a personal connection. Most of you probably don't. And it's very easy to shut off, even if for Ukrainians that are invested in Ukraine sometimes, that it's going on somewhere else. But until you understand that this is about each of us, and each of us, we're talking about democracies, has the power, then nothing is going to change, especially for people that have some sort of power, that have sort of way of power to speak, to be heard, to produce, to write, and everything. Because I feel like we are, in a way, still, when I come to the West, when I come to Europe, that there is a bit of like, oh, we're going to be okay. Like, it's not going to, there is a threat, and everyone is talking about a threat, but I don't see it a little bit as a climate change. But Putin just sitting in Russia was able to shut down 3 of your biggest airports just by drones. And honestly, like, I'm sorry, but Ukrainians were laughing a little bit because they were like, okay, and what are you guys going to do?
What are we guys going to do, Mary?
Yeah, well, I think Marina's quite right in its civicness that you see in Ukraine, and I think it was born of the Orange Revolution and the Revolution of Dignity. So there was a real commitment to democracy. But if I'm thinking of the one thing that is going to really matter, it's how the current wars end. I think if we're not able to defend Ukraine, that will make life terribly difficult, not just in terms of a direct threat from Russia, but in terms of the fact that what will happen to Ukraine? Will it become like the occupied territories, which is an area of criminality? And so making sure that Ukraine doesn't lose and trying to reach an agreement is the most probably important thing. But then, as I thought about it, I realized it's also true of Palestine. And the failure of the Europeans to protest more about the genocide in Palestine has hugely weakened the European Union and European legitimacy worldwide. And so I guess my one thing is the European Union needs to get its act together, and it needs to be at the table in Ukraine, and it needs to be at the table over Palestine, and it needs to use its economic power. It's the place that's going to pay for reconstruction and recovery to make sure that it has a real serious political role in these conflicts, because what happens in these conflicts, and I'd also add Sudan probably, is going to have huge implications for European security. And we're just thinking in this very narrow sense of Russian attacks on Europe and not thinking in this broader security context.
That was a very long 1 minute.
Sorry.
John.
All right, challenge accepted.
Yes.
So, one of the few sane Americans left alive, Jon Stewart, the comedian, says, the antidote to anxiety is action. And my proposal is training. It's not a very sexy answer, but bear with me. In the Cold War, the NATO alliance spent 40 years training for an inevitable, they thought, invasion from the Warsaw Pact. They had massive military maneuvers right here in Bavaria, 70 to 80,000 combat troops ripping across the countryside, causing damage, but they were preparing the civilian population. They were signaling to the Soviet Union, we are prepared, we are ready, come at us if you'd like. There's also practicality. We need to take unmanned systems and put them in the hands of people. Anyone, civilians, we need Bundeswehr soldiers, we need Lithuanian soldiers, all of Europe, we need to put these technologies into their hands so they can experiment, master them, and then this will have knock-on effects for deterrence to show Russia that we are serious here. And it also emphasizes the human capital that we all have. It is a shared activity that we can all do together as civilians, as soldiers, in any case. It also has the storytelling dimension. What are we training for? Why are we doing this? It engenders a certain aspect. And my takeaway point from this is the NATO alliance, if it succeeded in anything, was training for a war that never happened. But it is also the only war NATO ever won. So that's how I see it, at least.
Thank you, John. So, with these provocative thoughts again, we are opening the floor for questions from the audience, and then also we can take questions, if I'm correct, we can take questions from the stream, but there are no chat questions. Okay, so the floor is to your questions. The first hand was over there, yeah.
We'll work from and say who you are.
Yeah, please indicate your name and if there is an affiliation.
Well, I don't have an affiliation. I'm just here personally. My name is Vincent Homp. Lots of you were talking about speed, and to make it more concrete, I would like to know if you have any ideas what to neglect then. Like if you already know, maybe this is not for Marina, or maybe she knows as an observer what we in Europe should not do anymore to be more fast. And as a second, because the question here is that there's different professions here, historian, political scientist, and so on. What can you bring, so to say, or what are you already doing, or what do you want to do the next year to facilitate this speed, so to say? What do you want to bring into the discussion or actually do in your profession to make us faster?
So if the panel agrees, we are collecting questions so that we can answer them in a collecting way. Yes, yeah, I see.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. I'm Jakob Weinert from BSH Regensburg, and I just have a short question because I'd like to add to the factor of speed. You all talked about speed, and there's always this feeling that in the Western world that private companies are faster than the state. So I would like to ask, what roles do PMCs, do private military contractors, play in the procurement of drones and their use, as well as the vision that we have with drones in the West? That's it. Thank you very much.
Yes, the young gentleman here. Paul, if you... Oh.
And then we'll come.
Yes.
Yeah, I just had a question. Oh, sorry. I had a question. I'm from the NSC, so that's maybe a relationship. I had a question about the point on Palestine and the kind of relevance that has for Europe, and I guess the inverse, because I think from the US side, there's kind of a question of why should we care about Ukraine? Like that's a European problem, and I guess there might be some feelings like. So yeah, I just love to hear some more thoughts on that. Thank you.
My name is Sam. I'm also from the LSE. So yeah, I have a question about drones and like the role of companies. So the panel emphasized the importance of decentralized production in drone warfare and the importance of reducing costs in military procurement. However, ever since the end of the Cold War, we've seen defense industries in both the Europe and America being concentrated in a very few small, very powerful firms who, because of their market power, can charge very high prices for procurement. So how can democratic states work together to encourage the development of new firms and weaken the market power of the already existing dominant firms to help reduce procurement costs for new weapons such as drones and other more conventional weapons? Thank you.
Maybe we take two last questions in that set with Elia and the young lady sitting behind you.
Hello, my name is Irina, and I don't have any questions. Thank you very much. This is an amazing topic to talk about and very progressive. Thank you, guys. I'm just supporting the saying that if you want to do something, you can join the it's not Ukrainian, but Munich Drone Aid Collective. They are collecting drones always here in Munich and also in other towns. They are sending it to Ukraine, and you can also like make a drone your own. This is an amazing date idea for the 14th of February.
Okay, so I think we got the message. Just to not interrupt the questions.
Thank you very much, Elia Bescotti. Half of the panelists and the chair actually know me, but I'm from the Leibniz Science Campus. I have a stupidly academic questions, but a question that actually I think has some practical implications, though, and it would be, how do you actually deter someone who doesn't care about being deterred? I mean, we know there is research about that when it comes to terrorist groups, but, you know, what about neighboring states from bigger towards smaller powers. And I'm unfortunately not talking only about the Ukrainian case here, right? Yeah, that would be all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe we take that first set of questions and play it back to the panel. So who's maybe wanted to take the questions first, or has the question that he or she wants to do?
I have a bunch of answers.
Yeah.
So perhaps talking about speed, what can we do in a concrete way, talking about military procurement in Germany especially, we should stop over-qualifying systems, over-certifying systems. I mean, you have to do a basic qualification in terms of using warheads and everything else in our loitering munition. But I think it's good enough if industry partners like we have, say, are dealing with warhead engineering and everything else over decades. So there's no need for procurement agencies to do a second qualification. Also, the military or the industry partners have already done it. And the next topic is for next or this year. What I'm aiming for. I'm aiming for getting as much as possible of insights back from Ukraine to Germany, especially in terms of what is changing in warfare, because as pointed out, it's changing every 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 2 months. And it's not only about procuring weapon systems, as I pointed out, it's about how you use it and how the other side, our enemies, say are willing to use it. And we have to somehow raise awareness in our Western military forces, and it's not yet enough. And the last point is on private military contractors, what they can do, or I'm a big fan of these kind of agencies or institutions you have in Ukraine. They provide training because you have quite a lot of military guys, and they have been DJs and everything else before, engineers. And it's not too easy to fly some kind of FPV drones. I experienced it from my own perspective. And I think there is a big interest also in our Western militaries that you have agencies or NGOs that are willing to set up these kind of trainings, concepts and everything else. Yes.
Okay, if I just dive in with a few short thoughts. When it comes to private companies becoming too powerful, I think the lesson from Ukraine has been state-private combination and collaboration. So I think diversification is healthy. You need some of the big companies, otherwise you don't have the capacity to produce shells or whatever. But at the same time, I think diversification is one important route. In terms of what I'm going to do, well, I work for the Bundeswehr, so I hope my job. The one thing I would really like to see happen, and as much as it's possible, more public debate, more open debate. One of the problems in Germany is if you mention words like military and strategy, everybody starts to shake and doesn't want to talk about it, and their brains kind of shut down. They go into a complete meltdown. The problem is the country is, there are many military illiterates. They just don't like using military vocabulary. So we need to have more honest, open debates, but contextualize the military questions with the big strategic questions, the big questions of international relations. When it comes to the Palestinian question, I've got really, I suppose, I would answer that with another question. All the people who've been protesting about Palestine, why weren't they protesting about the Uyghurs in China? I'll leave it at that.
I'm going to try to quickly go through the points on what to neglect. I mean, I think it's all about prioritization, and I think it's wrong and naive to think that while you are facing a threat, you can also have an amazing life and not let go of something. Like, it is for real, if we all agree that there is a Russian threat or any kind of threat, it is impossible to invest money into any welfare and everything that you are doing, and at the same time to prepare for deterrence. The compromises have to be made. I mean, I am a big believer in real power and like real choices that are being made. So I think that's, I'm not going to speak on what Europe has to neglect because it's not my job and my understanding, but I think to understand that there has to be some of the compromises that are going to be painful, but that are about strategy and investment. The future is important. On the point of interaction between the state and the private sector. So what Ukraine has been doing, I think there's a lot can be learned from Ukraine here. Ukraine has some of the grants that we're giving to emerging companies. We're trying to attract investments a lot. And we also have like special tax regulations also for companies. So the state is actually trying to encourage the cooperation a lot. And also we have different state agencies at the Ministry of Defense that work together with manufacturers to try to hear what is needed for them. Like even the export decision that you see that recently our president said that we're opening export, it was a hugely debatable topic, and I'm not going to get into this why, but it was really done because of the interest in stimulating the industry and to giving it a bit more economical stimulus. And then on the how do you deter someone who doesn't care about being deterred? Interesting question. I believe that unless you have real power, they're not going to be scared of you and they're not going to be deterred. Russia understands strengths and power. That's something that every Ukrainian is going to tell you. And unless you have that, something that is real and not just concerns and promises, you're not going to be able to deter. I mean, again, as a student of political science and international relations myself, I can give you very political answers, but I can't anymore because I'm Ukrainian who came back to you here, and the first thing that I was happy about, that it's like I have electricity now for a couple of days that I'm here, and I can actually shower whenever I want, and I can charge my phone. Like, honestly, my whole team was like, wow, great, it's going to be 4 days, it's going to be amazing. But I see I'm being bombed every day. My father is fighting, place where I'm from was fully destroyed. My grandparents were in occupation. I believe in real actions and real power, not into discussions about possibilities of reactions and deterrence. Thank you.
Mary, tough job.
Oh, gosh. Well, the one thing I do agree with you about is that we have to have an open debate, and that's what we have not had up till now. I think it's been quite shocking how these quick decisions have been taken without a serious public debate. So I think that's number one. Things we should not do. We should not have nuclear weapons. I've always thought that, and I still think that, and I think nuclear weapons are very expensive. In the UK case, 40% of procurement is spent on nuclear weapons, which are anyway dependent on the US and which anyway don't work. But it also applies to big systems, and the question from somebody about big companies is in a way the big question that we have to think about. How do we deal with these legacy companies that are what are producing the legacy systems? That is what is costing our defense. So we need some real thought about that. On private military companies, I feel quite ambiguous. Of course, they've played a constructive role in Ukraine, but remember that the Wagner Group and the Night Wolves are also private military companies. And I think what we ought to be doing is, rather than emphasizing private in a market sense, we want much greater democracy. And we want much more democratic control, and that contributes to resilience. I think our big problem at the moment is that we have formal electoral democracy, and yet so many people feel they're not represented. Finally, Palestine. I can't understand why. Do you mean that I'm not allowed to protest about something because I haven't protested about something else? That seems crazy. I find that a very weird argument. But actually, I wasn't talking about protests. I was talking about European behavior. And Europe tries to present itself as representing international law. And one of the reasons why, admittedly also to do with misunderstandings about colonialism, is that Europe seemed to have double standards. It feels strongly about Russian aggression, but is not taking a similarly strong position on genocide in Palestine. That is a huge problem for the European Union in a global sense. What should the European Union be doing? Just putting much more pressure on Israel to stop what's happening in the West Bank, to stop a lot of what's still happening in Gaza, making sure that the European Union is there, discussing it. I mean, I'm not suggesting they join the Board of Peace, But I am suggesting that the European Union ought to have been taking much more prominent role. I also think that's true on Sudan. I can't understand why the whole thing has been handed over to the UAE and Saudi Arabia and Turkey and Russia. Where is the European Union on these really important conflicts that affect us?
So a lot on the agenda of the European Union to catch up. John.
I've picked 2 questions to respond to out of interest of time. So, in terms of speed, we need to have a culture of failure, because that's actually the driver of speed. It's not, innovation comes from failure. And I hate to continuously refer to training, but this is one of the major advantages, is you take, I mean, it's about multiplying the number of actors who have access to a piece of technology. If you go to Ukraine and you are a rich, powerful Western prime a defense manufacturer and you deliver kit that doesn't work, they send it back. They don't humor you with further conversation. They say, bring us something that works. And we need to have that type of culture here when we engage with the armed forces, but we also need to be less freaked out about communication between the armed forces and civil society. If I'm starting a business and I want to create a piece of kit that could potentially save the life of a soldier, I should be able to access that unit, which you can do in Ukraine. You can directly liaise with press officers who will then receive that tech. In terms of deterring someone who doesn't care about deterrence, and I want to be very, very clear about something. The United States is willing to use force, and Europe is not. Now, I think the Iraq War was an absolute disaster, and we are still living in the wake of the unbelievable Pandora's box of nightmare that George W. Bush opened, which I think is important to remember. But you can at least say the Americans are game when it comes to deterring their own enemies. Now, we can then question, why should, Venezuela or Greenland then come up on the list of deterrence? But the point remains, and I think that European unwillingness to use force is a reaction to that. That Europe observes this and says, my goodness, we don't want to invade Iraq, so they don't do anything short of that. Europe needs to be willing to exercise force, even if that means, and I'm sorry to say this, killing its adversaries, because that is ultimately where deterrence comes from.
Can I just add? I meant to say that I have a problem with deterrence because it contains the idea that you should threaten and terrify people. I'd much prefer the term dissuasion or containment. And I think that's the key issue that we're talking about. And even more so, I mean, we're talking about being able to withstand in the case of it. You may not be able to deter an attack. And if that means that you've then got to escalate, it becomes incredibly difficult. So you want to be able to dissuade, but you want to be able to withstand. And that's why being defensive and having resilience is so important. So, and as for your point about using force, yeah, sure, we should use force when it's consistent with international law, which means in terms of defense and in terms of protecting people. But I'm not really in favor of the kinds of ways that the United States tends to use force. And I don't think it does much good in terms of reducing the danger of war. On the contrary, I think it probably does the opposite.
So, a historian, a political strategist, and a general walked into a drone assembly workshop, and I think we were getting serious about deterrence warfare and also globalism or multilateralism. So thank you very much to the panel. I know some of you have next engagements, but maybe the others can stay if there are still further questions that are addressed then maybe bilaterally to the panel participants. Thank you very much. I think it's an ongoing debate that needs to be open and clear.